So all these issues came to a head in the summer of 1914, and the catalyst was an assassination that no one thought was that big of a deal at the time it happened. So it was a Sunday, July 28th, 1914, and the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were were back at their hotel. They had just gone from they had stayed on a resort, and then they had gone to church, and then they were going to drive to the town hall in Sarajevo where they were going to get received by the mayor, and their escort was the military chief of Bosnia. So no one thought it was going to be a particularly dramatic day. Uh, Franz Ferdinand was in Austria, or excuse me, Franz Ferdinand was in Sarajevo, Bosnia, in order to make a good showing, and he was relatively popular in the frontier areas of the empire because he had been someone who was for reforms. It was a reason why his great uncle Franz Joseph didn't really like him, is because Ferdinand was much more interested in reforming the empire, making it more modern, giving a lot of people more civil rights in different parts of it, and so forth. So he was in Sarajevo to make a good showing for the empire, and it was an important time for him since he and his wife were going to celebrate their wedding anniversary. They had been married 14 years. So and that was coming up in a couple days. And what was particularly nice for him was that he was able to actually keep Sophie out and about. So Sophie Chotek was a Czech woman who came from kind of lower end nobility, and she had met Franz Ferdinand when she was working for a another woman who was higher level nobility that was supposed to be a suitor for, or excuse me, supposed to be a prospect for Franz Ferdinand, and instead he fell in love with essentially the maid. Not only the maid, but a maid who was older. Oh, she was 32 when they got married, and that was already quite the scandal, since at age 32, a woman of her standing would have already been considered a spinster at that time. So the Habsburg family, in particular Emperor Franz Joseph, they did not like Sophie and tried to fight Franz Ferdinand marrying her as much as they could. Ferdinand eventually convinced his family to go along with it, but in order for them to accept it, or to at least tolerate the marriage, he had to sign a document which gave away the rights of his children to the throne. So Franz Ferdinand was the nephew of Franz Joseph, so he was in line to be emperor after Franz Joseph died, but his kids with Sophie would not be, and any of their kids would not be, as a result of the family hating this marriage. And so after Franz Ferdinand, the crown would go to someone else, or another member of the family, which the extended family was quite large. So, as a result of that, back in Vienna, in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Sophie was persona non grata. She was shunned by all the high level society, and so Ferdinand wasn't even allowed to ride with her in the same carriage a lot of times. But in Bosnia, which was the frontier, he was able to kind of have her around, and so it was kind of a happy time for them. So on that morning, on the 28th, they were driving from the hotel to the town hall, and there were a couple cars in their entourage, and unbeknownst to them, there was a group of terrorists there that had it out for them. So there were 6 young men who had traveled to Sarajevo for the purpose of killing the Archduke. Bosnian Serb teenagers. They were born in Bosnia and raised in Bosnia, but they were of Serbian descent. All of them were members of a group named Young Bosnia, which was a radical patriotic organization linked to a deeply secret Serb nationalist group called Union or Death, but known to its members as the Black Hand. The Black Hand terrorist, which is basically a terrorist cell, had been around for a while, but the Austro-Hungarian intelligence wasn't aware of them. The purpose of the Black Hand was to expand the Kingdom of Serbia and to encompass those Serb areas of Bosnia. Serbia had just won its independence a few years before against the Ottoman Empire, and it considered the Austro-Hungarians to be different kinds of conquerors that their people needed to be liberated from. So there were two attacks that day on Franz Ferdinand. The first one was a bomb attack by one of the members of that Black Hand cell, and the bomb actually came within like a foot of landing in the car. So the terrorist threw it essentially, and Ferdinand actually swatted it away with its arm and pushed it behind the car. And so they survived that attack, but the bomb exploded behind the car and it injured some people. So instead of going directly to the town hall like the military escort recommended he do, what Ferdinand wanted to do was go to the hospital to see the victims, the people who had been injured by the bomb. He thought that would be the right thing to do. So they told the drivers to start taking him over there, and the military escort thought it was okay because they were sure that these Serbian radicals would not engage in multiple terrorist attacks in one day or assassination attempts in one day. So they went to the hospital, or they were headed toward the hospital. They took a wrong turn, and the driver was ordered to turn around. It just so happened when the driver was turning around, they stopped 5 feet in front of one of the terrorist cell members, a guy named Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old, and wasn't really expecting to be the person who had this opportunity. But there he was, the Archduke, right there, and Princip stepped forward. He pulled out his revolver, shot twice into the car. Both of those shots hit their targets. One actually deflected. One bullet deflected through the car door into Sophie's abdomen and killed her, and then the other bullet went right into Franz's chest. And so that was that. Right after they were hit, Sophie cried out, "What's wrong?" when she saw Franz suddenly bleeding from his mouth, and then she slumped over and died. And he yelled at her, "Sophie, don't die! Stay alive for our children!" And then he slumped over and died. The crowd right around the car was trying to help him, trying to get his coat off to see if they could see where the wound was, although that wasn't going to help him. Both he and Sophie were dead within minutes. Princip himself tried to actually shoot himself in the head, but was stopped by a member of the crowd. And then he tried to swallow a cyanide vial that the terrorist group had given him so he could kill himself instead of get arrested. But it was expired cyanide, and so all it did was make him really sick to his stomach and didn't actually kill him. So he was captured and put in jail. He later admitted that he was sorry he killed Sophie, but obviously didn't apologize for the Archduke, who was the target. Around the world, this really wasn't a big deal immediately, least of all in Vienna. Franz Joseph's response was, and I quote, "A higher power has reestablished the order which I, alas, could not preserve." End quote. So Franz Joseph was actually happy because he didn't like Franz Ferdinand, didn't like the reforms he wanted to carry out, really hated his personal life, the fact that he had married Sophie, and was just about as happy that he was gone. It was really sad for his family, and from the accounts we have, Ferdinand was a nice guy. He was known to love his children so much. He would play with them on the floor in front of dignitaries. He was so enthralled with his own children, and obviously the murder was devastating to them. But to world leaders, it really wasn't. Not to Franz Joseph, who wasn't that upset. You'd think the old emperor would be upset about the heir dying, but he was actually kind of happy that the throne would now go to one of the great grandnephews. In Britain, France, Germany, Russia, there were some messages of sympathy sent to Austria, and that was about the extent of it. Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany didn't really care. Tsar Nicholas in Russia didn't really care. He had bigger issues going on with his own son, who was sick. And France was actually embroiled in a sex scandal at the time. There was kind of a murder slash sex scandal that was dominating their news, and so the assassination was relatively minor news for them, or kind of moderate news. And in the U.S., most people's response was, okay, here's another world leader that's been assassinated, someone we don't know from somewhere we don't know where it is. What does this matter? There had been quite a few assassinations of kind of moderately prominent world leaders of this type for the last 40 years, going back to the 1880s. Anarchist groups, terrorist groups had assassinated various world leaders, of which people thought Franz Ferdinand was just another one. What no one expected, though, was that this was going to set in motion a series of chain reactions that would lead directly to war within about 6 to 7 weeks. That's what no one expected. That was called the July Crisis, which you'll read about in your readings, and I'll talk about next time when we talk about the first year of the war. So for now, what you've got is a couple documentaries that I want you all to watch. One, just a clip from a documentary that will cover the Herero Revolt and give you a sense of kind of the cultural impact of that kind of colonial warfare. And then the first episode of a documentary called The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, which will go into the issues I've just talked about in more depth. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you at in the next unit.